Some animals will hibernate. And they'll move. Or sorry, not hibernate. Migrate. They'll move to a warmer place. Some will tough it out. There's quite a few different types of small mammals, raccoons and squirrels and things that just tough it out in the winter, and they store food for the winter, or they just are really good at scavenging food. But all things need to be able to sense and respond to change because God's creation is always changing. It's changing, but it does so in a pattern. There's not just chaos to the change, there is order in the change. And last but not least, all life forms reproduce. So there's two types of reproduction. There's asexual reproduction, and then there's sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is reproduction accomplished by a single organism. So that organism is going to produce a clone of itself. There are types of, and we see this more frequently, this asexual reproduction, in really small things. Really, really small things, like bacteria or protozoans. There are some plants, though, that are able to produce runners, like strawberries actually produce runners. There's like a main plant and it just produces runners, and it could just keep going and going and going, and 50 feet down, that strawberry plant is actually identical to the one over there because they're all connected. And even though it seems like it's a different plant, it's actually not because it's connected to the original one. So some things can produce clones of themselves. Then we have sexual reproduction, which is reproduction that requires two organisms, male and female. This is how most macroscopic or larger organisms reproduce. So things that we can see with our eyes. This is the primary method of reproduction in plants and animals. It also is beneficial, more beneficial than cloning, because every time that you are able to have a male and a female reproduce an offspring, that offspring is genetically unique. It's not like the mom and it's not like the dad. It's a combination of the two. So it brings diversity to the gene pool. And diversity can manifest itself in resilience to disease or to other conditions. So it's good because it creates a stronger population. So inheritance is the process by which physical and biological characteristics are transmitted from the parent to the offspring. So some of you might look like your parents. Some of you might look nothing like your parents. Just depends on the genes that you inherited. It's amazing how my little boy is like, there's certain things that I'm like, wow, that looks just like my husband, and that looks just like me. And I just had, my sister just had her first baby. She's actually 2.5 weeks old, so she's itty bitty tiny. And she's like, I'm like looking at her, I'm like, I can see my sister, but then I see Joseph, her husband, and that. And so it's just crazy, that inheritance of those physical characteristics that can be such a mix. As we're seeing, even in the midst of everything that's going on with the coronavirus, it doesn't affect each person the same way, right? And what is it that makes it so some people experience no symptoms and some people end up in the hospital in critical care? And part of it is age, but then you'll have the random 28-year-old that you hear about, and you're just like, what in the world happened? And genetics, there are things there that if everyone was a clone of the 28-year-old that's in ICU, then woo, that's not looking too good for all of us, that's not a good thing. But because we have this diversity, this genetic diversity, different people have a different level of resilience typically to different diseases. Now, there are certain diseases that's not as much of a case for, like Ebola, for instance. Ebola is pretty nasty, and if you're exposed to Ebola, you're going to get Ebola, and it's going to be a pretty nasty infection, and very few people survive, and even fewer people survive without medical assistance, like hardly anyone. I don't want to say no one, but very, 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 very few people. And those few people that manage to It's because of diversity, so in their genes. So it's a good thing that makes a stronger population. And then finally, mutation. Mutation is an abrupt and marked change in DNA from an organism compared to its parents. So it's something in the DNA or in the genetic process during conception that ended up happening different than the parents had. Most of the times those manifest themselves in the form of diseases. And some mutations can happen down the road, like cancer is a mutation of a cell that allows it to just keep growing and growing and growing and not stop growing. And obviously that's not something you're born with, but, well, depending on the cancer. Some people are more prone to certain types of mutations. But a lot of mutations can happen during the very early embryonic phases, and other ones can happen even later in life. Okay, what time is it? 11:04. We're actually going to skip down because some of these notes we're going to talk about next week. We're actually going to skip down to the biological classification section. That way we can do a lab activity today. So we're going to skip over the scientific method section, and we'll come back to that next week and fill it in. So we're going to do the biological classification, which goes along with the lab activity. So scientists love categories. They love to classify things, they love to organize things, and they love finding like little differences that allow them to make a new category and classify something in a different way. Like they're like classification nerds. And so this is really impressive. Science is impressive in the fact that there are a lot of things that as a world we don't agree on. Different cultures don't agree on. Okay? But when it comes to science, scientists all agree on using this classification system. And scientists all agree on using the scientific math method. It's like really kind of a cool point of agreement across the world, which is, just neat to see. And so here are the levels of the classification system. The domain is relatively new in the last probably 15 years or so. Your book talks about that a little bit. When I learned the classification system, it was just kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And by the time I got to college, they'd added the domain. Your textbook talks about the domain. I'm not actually sure what the new edition of the textbook does, because this is the first edition, and they just came out with a new edition in May. This is the second edition. They just came out with the third edition in May, so I'll be interested to see if they actually include the domain now. So for the sake of your textbook does divide. It discusses domain briefly, and then chooses to still use the 5 kingdoms instead of using the domain classification. What the domain does is the domain categorizes things on cell type. So bacteria cells are very, very different from animal and plant cells, and we'll see that difference here in just a second. And so they added the domain in order to zoom out and say, these things are plants and animals because they have this type of cell. These things are all bacteria because they have this type of cell. So kingdom Monera, if you're using the domain, technically is no more. But if you're still using the old classification system, then there are 5 kingdoms. So the kingdoms are Protista, fungi, plantae, animalia, and then Monera, which would be the bacteria. So the first and most basic definition of how we classify organisms, and this is where adding the domain does make sense, is their cell type. So prokaryotic cell versus a eukaryotic cell. So prokaryotic cell, which is this type right here, is a cell that has no distinct membrane-bound organelles. Whew, that sounds kind of complicated. Basically, what it's communicating is it's way more chaotic inside. It's not as organized. Bacteria are not as organized as plant and animal cells. Even though there's a lot going on inside of this eukaryotic cell, it's actually a lot more organized. Each one of the organelles, which is like a mini cellular organ, and we'll learn about those functions later on, has a boundary, has a membrane around it. In bacterial cells, there are no membranes around things, so it's just like, blah! It's like a clean bedroom versus a messy bedroom. It's like a bedroom that has all of your clothes and papers and books just like thrown around without furniture to organize it in. Or a bedroom that has the clothes where they belong in the closet and the dresser drawers and the books on the bookshelves where they belong. Like the same stuff is there, but it's just organized versus unorganized. And I shouldn't actually say the same stuff is inside of a prokaryotic cell because a eukaryotic cell actually has a lot more structures and information inside of it. It's more complex in that way. I don't really like to refer to things as simple organisms and complex organisms because even organisms that are classified as simple are incredibly complex. But when comparing the two, this one definitely has more complex things going on versus this has simpler things going on inside of it. So Kingdom Monera would contain all the prokaryotes. And there would be two different types of prokaryotes. There are the just normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill bacteria, and then there's something called archaeans or extremophiles, which are those bacteria which I mentioned earlier that feed on chemicals and weird things and are found like in volcanoes and deep parts of the bottom of the ocean floor around hydrothermal vents and just in really extreme weird places. And then the domain Eukaryota, which contains all the eukaryotes, which would be all of the plants, animals, fungi, and protozoans. So now we're going to look at the kingdoms which would fall under that eukaryote classification. So first there's kingdom Protista. And the protists contain organisms that are composed of only one eukaryotic cell. So it is a single-celled organism. There's only one cell. Sometimes they're referred to as single-celled animals because they kind of behave like if you're looking at the microscopic world of protozoans, they kind of behave and hunt like animals do, only they're single-celled and it's all happening in like a drop of pond water. So they are one-celled, and there's a lot of diversity in the different types, and we'll get to that near the middle of the year. They're really cool, though. But that's their distinguishing characteristic. Just making sure, don't see pencil still moving. Are the notes making sense? Is everyone tracking pretty well with how to? Okay. So.
One of them, I think there's 2 slides ago, like right at the bottom. It's talking about the domain blank and blank something else. It was on the backup slide, I just missed it.
Oh.
It was the one before this one. It says that right at the top, actually.
Prokaryotic. I see what you're saying. It should be this one. I forgot to include that. So it's domain. I said it, but I didn't have it written down. I'll write it on the board. I need to get out my markers. Oh, thank you. So it is domain, bacteria, and archaea. Yep. So those blanks are going to be bacteria and archaea. Thank you. I appreciate that. You know what? I go through and I like double check these, and it still amazes me the things that I'm still missing and the edits that I still have to make. So I appreciate it when you bring that to my attention, because then it allows me to fix things. Okay, fungi. Fungi mostly composed of multicellular decomposers. Mostly. That's the key word here. Not all fungi are decomposers, and not all fungi are multicellular, but mostly. The only one that I can actually think of off the top of my head that I know for a fact is not a decomposer and also is not multicellular is yeast. So yeast is technically a fungi, and we use it to make bread. And so it is actually single-celled and is not a decomposer because it's going to feed on sugars and things in the bread, which is what helps your bread rise when you're baking it. Because in their process of eating sugar, they produce carbon dioxide, and that gets trapped in your bread and makes it fluffy. The things you learn in biology. Most fungi that we're familiar with, though, are like mushrooms and things like that. Plantae. Plantae is mostly, once again key, composed of multicellular autotrophs. So they're going to have more than one cell, and they're going to make their own food. And like I said, that is 99.8% of plants. There's always exceptions, though, to almost everything. They also have a cell wall. So that's an interesting feature of their cells. Where animal cells don't have a cell wall, plant cells have a rigid cell wall, which is what helps give them their structure. And then finally, we have Animalia, which is mostly composed of multicellular heterotrophs. So they're multicellular, and they can't make their own food. Okay, so we're going to spend the majority of our time looking at different, I guess we'll be looking at different phylum and stuff, though, too, so I guess I don't want to say that. So kingdoms are one of the most, really is the most, other than cell type, broad category of the classification system. So there's a lot of diversity in Kingdom Animalia. I mean, that's everything from mouse to a blue whale. Okay, there's a lot of diversity, and they're both mammals. So technically, you could say a tadpole to elephant. So there's a lot of diversity in Kingdom Animalia. The most specific, the most narrow of the classification system is the species. Okay, the species is going to be the most narrow. So it's a unit of one or more populations of individuals that can reproduce under normal conditions, and they can produce fertile offspring and are reproductively isolated from other such units. So what really determines if something is its own species is whether it can breed and make create offspring that can also breed. So when we think about like lions and tigers, okay, they are very similar in a lot of ways, but yet they're different species because a lion and a tiger can't breed and produce viable offspring, meaning they can't breed and make offspring that can also breed. They can technically breed them, and they have, and it's a liger, but a liger is sterile. A liger can't make any more offspring. Also, you have differences in even tigers, like Bengal tigers and Siberian tigers. They are reproductively isolated from one another because of mountain ranges and things like that. I'm actually not 100% certain if they could breed and produce viable offspring or not. But one of the things that makes them different species is the fact that they are isolated from one another, so they can't reproduce because they don't have access to each other. Taxonomy is the science of classifying organisms. That does not sound like a very exciting science to me, but some people just get geeked about taxonomy, in which case I'm glad that there are people like that, so I don't have to do it. And when classifying things, when giving something a name, scientists use what's known as binomial nomenclature, meaning there are two Latin words assigned to each species. So when you say the species of something, you're not actually just saying the species, you're saying the genus and the species. So Felis catus is the species, it's the name of a domestic house cat. It's what different, because in a lot of ways, domestic house cats are like bobcats or lynx or even tigers, but they are different because they've been domesticated, and, well, you can't breed a tiger and a house cat and produce viable offspring. And so they have their own species name, but when you're to say it, you use both the genus and the species, not just the species. Latin is also the language that is used for the scientific names. So there's lots of common names for animals, but when you look at a, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a key, a guide, like a field guide. Like if you're going out and you're going hiking in the Pacific Northwest and you want to be able to identify different birds and animals that you see, you would get a field guide that would have all the different animals that are native to that part of the country. And they would have the common names, but they would also have the scientific name. Because regardless of where you are in the world, that animal is going to be referred to whether you speak Japanese or Arabic or English. The scientific name is the same. The common name is going to be different, and the common name is going to be different in your language. But the scientific name is the same. Latin is probably chosen because it's the dead language and it doesn't show favoritism to anyone, to any one country in the world. So it's done in Latin. And one cat, big cat, it's a really good example of this, that this is, well, what is it? What is this? Does anybody know what this is? Puma. Okay, that's one of the things that it goes by. Does anybody else have a name for this? Cougar. Mountain lion. Yeah, those are all puma, cougar, mountain lion, sometimes it's called the ghost cat. Okay, these are all terms that are defining the same cat. And its scientific name is Puma concolor, and it's found all over the North America, from Canada down to Florida. And all of them can breed and produce viable offspring because although that's a really wide geographic range, there's technically nothing that really keeping them from, other than distance, but there's mixing of the gene pool there. Now, mountain lions in Canada are usually bigger and have denser fur than mountain lions in Florida because of the cold weather versus warmer weather down in Florida, but it's the same cat. So it shows the importance of scientific name because there's lots of different common names that you can call it. Okay, So we're going to do an activity here using and becoming familiar with, and we'll just get as far as we can with this. If we have to finish it up a little bit next week, that's fine. But we're going to use something called a biological key. Yes? Yes, you may. And we're going to be working through classifying some different organisms. So how we do that is we use something called a dichotomous key. And a dichotomous key is called dichotomous because it asks two questions, and then depending on the organism that you're trying to figure out what it is, you will either answer yes or no to that question. So if my organism is let's say I have a snake. Okay, and I'm trying to figure out what vertebrae does this belong to? What group of vertebrates does a snake belong to? I'm going to start at the top, and I'm going to look at the snake, and I'm going to go, the dichotomous key is going to ask me two questions. Does it have fur? Does it not have fur? I'm going to be like, it doesn't have fur. Then it's going to ask me another set of questions. Does it have feathers? Does it not have feathers? It doesn't have feathers. Then it's going to ask me another set of questions. Does it have dry skin or does it have moist skin? And I'm going to be like, it has dry skin, which then dead ends in the reptile. So dichotomous key asks two questions, which you're going to either be like yes or no to. And then that's going to either dead end into the answer to your question, what group of animals does this belong to, or I'm going to keep going down the trail. And it's not always just animals, because you can do it for bacteria, protozoans, etc. But it is going to be dead end into the group of organisms. So let's see here. How many of these did I print? Actually, what I'm going to do, because we'll work in groups of 3, but there's 4 at tables, and I have 6 tables. So I'm going to have 2 groups actually just go into the kitchen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Oliver. I'm going to have you join Mikhail and Trustin. And Jillian, I'll have you join, I know Tenhoff. Is it Lily? Was it Lillian? Okay. Lillian, and I can't remember your name. Hope. I'm going to have you join them at that table. Boys, I'm going to have you go into the kitchen. And then I'm going to grab Will and
Ike.
What did you say?
Ike.
Ike.
It was Isaac in the...
Okay, I was going to say, I don't remember that. Ike and, well, you guys are at table 3. Are we missing one person?
Yeah, she's going to.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Danny, if you want to join them. And if you 3 will go into the kitchen. Nope. You'll need one of these, which is the key, and then you 3 will work together here. You 3 will work together here. You 3. You 3, and this actually can